Well, it also goes back to Abraham, because when Abraham was digging wells, Abimelech said, "This isn't yours." But it also happened to his son, Isaac, when he was digging wells. Same thing. They were always trying to take the land from those who were given the land by the God, the one God. So it's hasn't changed much over the years. But from a 20th century position, it's very important to understand how it went from the Balfour Declaration to the League of Nations, subsequently to San Remo. And in San Remo, they basically codified the fact that the land was for the reconstitution of the Jewish homeland. It wasn't to create a new state like they did with Transjordan or the boundaries of Lebanon or Syria. It was the reconstitution of the Jewish homeland. So everybody knew it was the Jewish homeland. The question was, how much did we get? American Jews have always been uncomfortable with the whole concept of a land-based Jewish state. The fights that went on in 1947, 48, and 49 were primarily between Ben Gurion and a guy named Jacob Blaustein, who at the time was the head of the American Jewish Committee. And the deal was, you can come to America and raise money, but do not talk about Israel being Jewish. You got to help your brothers out, because they don't appreciate what I did for them in 1948. And hasn't changed much. In fact, well, I gave you a copy of the article where, again, something happened to this fellow, Richard Wexler, who was a Federation groupie. He also happened to be the national head of the federations. And now he's realizing that some of the people in his former committee are saying that Zionism is much too controversial. So we're going back to 1975, and Zionism is racism. I mean, that's really what their discomfort is. And unfortunately, in the Jewish community, they don't know very much about their heritage. It's more than a bris and a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, a meretz chuppah, and getting buried. It's certainly more than an hour and a half of sitting and listening to a sermon for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And it's sad. There's no other religion that has so many Hagim, holidays, where we're supposed to connect with our God. I mean, right after Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we have Simchas Torah, we have Shmini Atzeret, we have Shabbat. I mean, it's like every week we got to reconnect with this jealous God. And we have to connect with him in a very loving way. And a lot of Jews don't feel very comfortable with that, especially again in the diaspora. I was working with several people at AIPAC, Larry Hochberg and Bob Asher, and they were mentoring me on how to be able to lobby in Washington. And I was sort of like their little gopher for a while, but I was learning how to approach congressmen and senators. And in 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected, AIPAC had a change in their philosophy, and they brought in two people from Peace Now, a woman named Amy Friedkin and another fella by the name of Steve Grossman. And after meeting with them a couple times, in general, I could not, in good faith to myself, deal with their philosophy of Peace Now. And so I decided to leave lobbying and put it aside, but I had met a woman by the name of Esther Levins. And Esther said, well, if you're not going to work with AIPAC and you've learned some of the techniques of lobbying, would you be willing to work with us? And I said, well, you know, I come to Washington, I think it's fun, it's interesting, and yes, I will work with Voices United for Israel. I then realized something that was very obvious, but only obvious from the standpoint of you had to see the two experiences. In one of my first lobbying efforts, Esther asked me to go with a reverend to see a Senator Bill Frist. Now, oftentimes when you were lobbying, or when I was lobbying with AIPAC, you would see a legislative aide, you might see the Middle East person who was on that particular subject. Very rarely, other than maybe the senator, the congressman would stick his head in, say hello, and off he would go. Esther asked me to go with this reverend from, of all places, Tennessee, to go see Senator Bill Frist, who was on the Appropriations Committee. And I figured, okay, it'll be interesting. The reverend was probably about 5'6", 5'7", a rather schlumpy-looking fella, wearing a suit. We walk into Bill Frist's office. His receptionist sort of stands at attention, says that the senator will be with you in a moment. The senator, not his legislative aide. 2-3 minutes later, the senator comes out of his office, shakes the reverend's hand, and oddly enough, the reverend walks into his office first, followed by Bill Frist, and then me. The reverend sits down at his desk, takes off his jacket, puts it on the back of his seat. He's sitting in front of one of the most powerful senators in the United States Senate in his t-shirt. And the senator immediately takes out a pad of paper and begins writing down whatever the reverend is asking him to do. I am in shock. I have never seen this happen before. As we get done, the senator says to the reverend, "Is there anything else you would like me to do?" That, again, was not something that I had ever seen. As the reverend goes to put his coat on, or his jacket, he turns toward me, and I could read now what's on the t-shirt. The t-shirt said, "God will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel." I was like stupefied. I ran back to see Esther, and I said, "I just saw the most amazing thing I have ever seen in all my years of lobbying." I told her what happened. She said, "Well, that's very simple, because Reverend," and I forgot the fellow's name, controls about 150,000 votes in a place called Nashville. Votes, I mean, Jews give money, but ultimately the election is going to be decided by the number of votes. And from that point on, I met a guy named Dick Hellman, and I started to meet other evangelical Christian groups, both in Washington, and then I became more aware of them in Israel. A friend and I brought in another reverend during the Gulf War. His name was Reverend Frank Eichler. I'll never forget it. My synagogue was very, very nervous about having an evangelical Christian, but at the same time, I think they were nervous about me perhaps doing something that would not look great in the community, which they were right, because I thought bigot and intolerant were the words that might have come off my lips. So Frank came in, and he had been packing first aid kits during the Gulf War for Israeli soldiers. He got up. We had about 300 people at the synagogue. Mostly they were naysayers who wanted to be able to sort of stick it to the rabbi for allowing a Christian to come speak at our synagogue. The Consul General of Israel from Chicago was also there, a fellow named Uri Barnea. Eichler gave a very impassioned speech, sermon of Israel. And at the end, he said something that was absolutely no one has ever forgotten. Because he looked out to all the Jews and he said, "Israel for you is the most dangerous place in the world." Now you have to imagine, this is during the Gulf War, Scuds are coming in. He's there packing first aid kits for soldiers. He said, "I guess you people didn't hear what I have to say." He said, "Israel for you is the most dangerous place in the world." Total silence. Because you might go there, learn to love it, and never want to come back. And with that, the Consul General jumps up, gives him a big hug and a kiss, and people are cheering it was, again, one of those moments that were just, sometimes people need a leader or someone to give them direction, to open their eyes. There's a Yiddish saying that basically, if I didn't believe it, I wouldn't have seen it. And there it was. It's right there. So, and after that, for the last, well, since the early 1990s, the last 20 years or so, I've been working with evangelicals. I've worked with the Lutherans in a dialogue to make sure that they disavowed the anti-Semitic teachings of Luther. But I find it very amazing that all of a sudden, for whatever reasons, God has asked the Christians to help their Jewish brothers understand with gratitude what he did for us and our people in 1948. And the Christians definitely understand it. I think we talked a little bit about my friends at Shorshim in Jerusalem, where he gives talks and dialogues in their shop with Christians, and I try to keep quiet, but at one of the meetings, he was talking to a gentleman, a young man, probably at 30, and he knew so much about the Torah of the Old Testament that afterwards I walked up to him and I asked him, you know, how do you know so much about the Torah? He said, I study it every day. In my mind, I would have liked to have said, Jews should only study it every day. And I said, but well, where are you from? He said, Colorado Springs. I said, what do you do? He said, I'm a janitor at a high school. Once again, amazing that these are things that I was not perhaps as sensitive to, but I've used them in many of my talks and my writings. It's just, it's an amazing thing that our Christian brothers and sisters are now so forceful when it comes to Zionism. And as we also discussed, the Jewish community in America is concerned right now that the word Zionism seems to have a negative connotation. There are several reasons. One is, obviously, I was already involved with understanding the Christian aspects of Israel. One of my first friends who gave me comfort, and we were both thought to be outcasts, was Yechiel Eckstein. But my own situation was that people said very nasty things about me when I first went off to work with evangelical Christians. And as word got out that you were coming to one of the suburbs of Chicago, I decided whenever I have a chance to meet new people, especially from the Christian side, I want to avail that to myself. As you began to speak, one of the people who supports you put me in shock, because years before he told me that working with Christians was really out of bounds. And the fact that he's finally come around amazed me, but certainly he's also said often that I'm oftentimes ahead of the curve. And working with you and seeing the work that you're doing is very important. It's important not just for the Christians, but it's very important for the Jews. They really need some support and some understanding, and the nonsense of the excuses they've used too often, that evangelical Christians are waiting for the rapture and then they're going to convert you. And as I've said to many, I said, I want to see when Jesus comes back too, because I want to know what shul he's going to go to. And I've worked with 3 people in particular who now live in Israel who I've converted to Orthodox Judaism. I've had a wonderful experience with them, seeing their adventure. But ultimately, when he comes back, he may not know the name Jesus, but he's going to know the name Yehoshua ben Yosef. And I find it fascinating. I study many of the Christian theologians who've written about Jesus. One of the real misnomers, and I had a wonderful experience the last time I was in Israel, because some very Orthodox Jewish people who live in Hebron, I explained to them Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion. And they said, that's not what we understood. Now, Jews always have an opinion on things they know nothing about. And if you talk to the everyday Jew who's part of Federation or ADL, they've never seen the movie, but they have nothing but nasty things to say. Granted, Mel Gibson may be a little kooky, but the movie itself is a Jewish movie. It has nothing to do with Christianity. The fella that they're beating up is a Jew. They're beating him because he's a Jew. It's the Romans who are beating him. And yes, there was an evil priest, we have some bad guys too, called Caiaphas, who made his deal monetarily with Pontius Pilate. But the worst part about the movie for a Jew, if they really understand it from the Jewish perspective, is there's a line in Leviticus that says, "Thou shalt not stand idly by the shedding of your brother's blood." All the people who were standing around watching him be scourged by the Roman pagans who said nothing and did nothing were his fellow Jews. So I happened to be with a very Orthodox fellow who I had snuck six, can't say snuck, but it was obvious when I went through security that I had 6 copies of The Passion in my overnight case. The security people saw it, they let it go through. I handed out 6 copies in Israel. And 3 of the people said that when they watched it through Jewish eyes, they understood. It was a very, very powerful, and even in the movie, when Gibson used Aramaic, you could tell that they were calling him Rabbi, and they were also calling him Yehoshua ben Yosef. So it was, I felt, a very important movie. When I stood up at the Federation to tell everyone there that they should go see the movie or rent it, again, I was ostracized, but that's never been something that I worry about. And now, what I've tried to do in some of the venues that I'm speaking at is turn it around. Because now Christians are being slaughtered all over the world. And even the Christian community doesn't know how to deal with it. And as much as in the Archbishop of England's retort to openness and tolerance, the Muslims who live in England do very much feel that at some point they're going to take over England. They can be fools, and they can play this little universalistic or moral relativistic game, but these people are serious. And anyone who reads the Quran has to understand that the Quran is a theocratic guide to how you are going to not just be a religion, but how you are going to be a society. And it is problematic. There are 2 issues here. One is if you're a believer in God giving the land to the Jews, that's where I come from. Then there's the laws of man. And certainly after the First World War, most people know of the Balfour Declaration, which was to reconstitute, not create, but to reconstitute the national homeland of the Jewish people. That was solidified in 1920 at San Remo, where countries such as Saudi Arabia were created, boundaries between Lebanon, Syria were created, and the findings, or the ratification in 1920 is what gave Israel and the Jewish people their reconstituted land from not the river to the sea, but from the Euphrates, basically. It was in 1922 that the good old British, who never saw an agreement they could betray, came up with the idea of Transjordan and cut 78% of the land, giving it to create a country that never existed called Transjordan, with the understanding and agreement that all of the land west of the Jordan was going to be now for the reconstitution of the Jewish homeland. What's interesting about this is that there were 5.5 million square miles of land that was divided up. The original mandate, which included Transjordan, was 1%. 99% was given to the Arabs. 1% was given to the Jews. When the 78% of Transjordan was created, that meant that the Jews got 1/4 of 1% of the land that was given to the Arabs in 1920, 1922. So if 1/4 of 1% today from the river to the sea is too much, the issue, as I told people back in 1993 when the Oslo Accords were agreed to on the White House lawn, has nothing to do with land. It only has to do with existence. Subsequently, we had a war in 1948. We had another war in 1967. And from the time of 1967 until now, Jews have begun to live in what we consider our biblical homeland. Any Jew, rabbi or other, who uses the term West Bank is using the terminology of our enemies. The land is called Judea Samaria. It is the biblical homeland. As I've often said, Abraham never walked the streets of Tel Aviv, but he certainly walked the streets of Hebron. And from the standpoint of King David, he never lived in Herzliya, but we know he lived in a place called Jerusalem. And from that point on, as Yoram Ettinger talks about the demographics, today, 2012, we have a 67% majority from the river to the sea of Jews over Arabs. We're projecting with what's going on that within the next 10 years we will have an 80% majority from the river to the sea. There is no rational reason for a two-state solution. There never was. It makes no sense. And a people who want to give up their biblical heritage are people who have a very weak sense of self. I've been saying this for 15 years. You can imagine in the Jewish community how perhaps it's not the most ingratiating position, but certainly Judea Samaria is our homeland. Tel Aviv is a nice place. It shows the incredible strength and mental capacity for the Israelis. I often talk about my two-state solution, which is one for the Israelis and one for the Jews. It's always been the conflict between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. But certainly there's no one who would give up their grandparents' grave and the memory of who we are as a people. And people who want to give up our biblical homeland are people who have a mental pathology.